The room was small, too small for what was about to happen inside it. Somewhere in the haze of a backstage corridor, cigarette smoke curling toward a bare bulb, amplifiers still warm from the show, Albert King picked up a guitar that didn't belong to him. He turned it over in his enormous hands, tested the weight of it, and then looked directly at the young man standing across from him. "Let me show you," Albert said, "how this is supposed to be done." What followed wasn't a performance. It wasn't a duel, not exactly. It was something older than that, a confrontation between two men who carried the same ancient sound inside them, but had arrived at it through completely different roads. One of them was a giant of the blues, and a left-handed titan who had bent strings with a force that seemed to defy the physics of the instrument itself, who had spent 20 years building something vast and uncompromising before the world even knew his name. The other was 25 years old, newly famous, carrying a sound that had crossed the Atlantic and returned transformed into something the world had never heard before. But there was a problem, and Albert King wanted it addressed. The problem wasn't the music. The problem was credit, and the problem was history. And if you understand how music moves through time, how sound passes from one set of hands to another, how influence travels without always announcing itself, then you understand why the moment Albert King lifted that guitar was about something much bigger than two men in a hallway. This is that story. And to understand what happened between Albert King and Jimi Hendrix, you have to go back to a particular kind of American geography. Not cities, not stages, not recording studios. You have to go back to the rural South, to the deep blues tradition that produced a specific vocabulary of pain and beauty that would eventually reshape every corner of popular music. But not before it passed through the hands of men who would never receive the credit they deserved. Albert King was born in 1923 in Indianola, Mississippi, a town that had already produced one of the most important figures in blues history. He grew up surrounded by cotton fields and church music, and the particular silence of a world that offered very little to a black man in the American South in the years between the wars. Music wasn't a career choice. It wasn't a dream. Oh, not in the way the word is used now, when it carries the soft glow of possibility. For Albert King, music was a way of surviving, a way of speaking when speaking directly was dangerous, a way of carrying everything that could not otherwise be carried. He taught himself to play guitar left-handed, but here is the crucial detail. He played a right-handed guitar, flipped upside down, without restringing it. This meant that his entire relationship to the instrument was inverted from everything the instrument had been designed to do. The strings ran in reverse order. The bass strings sat where the treble strings should have been. Every technique that a conventional guitarist had learned through years of muscle memory was, for Albert King, a different physical action entirely. Yet what this produced, this radical inversion of the expected, was a sound that no one else could replicate. Because it wasn't just a matter of copying the notes. It was a matter of inhabiting a completely different physical relationship to the instrument. When Albert King bent a string, he was pulling against the grain in ways that were unique to his particular configuration, his particular strength, his particular hands. The sound that emerged from those bends was broader, rawer, more physically present than almost anything being produced by guitarists working in the conventional orientation. It was a sound of resistance transformed into music, and then there was the size of him. Albert King stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. His hands were enormous. When he wrapped those hands around a guitar neck, the instrument looked like a toy. When he bent a string, he didn't so much as manipulate the instrument as overwhelm it, pulling the note somewhere it had never intended to go, and then holding it there, suspended in that impossible place, until the tension became unbearable, and then, slowly, resolved. This is what Jimi Hendrix heard. This is what changed him. By the time the two men encountered each other in the late 1960s, Jimi Hendrix had become something that the music industry rarely produces, a genuine phenomenon. Not just a popular artist, not just a successful one, a figure around whom the entire landscape of popular music had shifted. The guitar had sounded one way before him, and another way after, and there was no going back. But the path that led to that transformation had a map, and Albert King's name appeared on that map in letters large enough that it should have been impossible to overlook. In the years before London, before the experience, before the festivals and the recordings that would define the psychedelic era, Jimi Hendrix had been a working musician on the so-called Chitlin Circuit, the network of venues and clubs that served black audiences in a racially segregated America. He had played behind soul singers and rhythm and blues acts, traveling in cramped buses to towns he'd never heard of, sleeping in whatever accommodation would accept him, learning through thousands of hours of live performance what the guitar could do when pushed to its limits. And he had listened. That was the word people used when they tried to explain how Jimi Hendrix learned. He listened. He absorbed. He heard something in Albert King's recordings, in the wide, impossible bends, in the way a note could be stretched until it became something more like a human cry than a musical tone, in the raw, physical authority of that sound. And he internalized it so deeply that it became a part of the architecture of his own playing. But there is a difference between learning from someone and crediting them. And Albert King, who had spent decades doing the work before anyone outside of the blues world was paying attention, who had recorded and performed and perfected his approach long before psychedelic rock existed as a category, felt that difference keenly. This is the tension that arrived with him into that backstage room. And the specifics of time and place vary depending on whose account you follow, as is often the case with backstage encounters that were witnessed by few people and documented by fewer. But the essential dynamic is consistent across multiple accounts from the period. Albert King and Jimi Hendrix were in proximity, as they were on several occasions during the late 1960s, when their respective worlds overlapped in the way that music worlds do: festival circuits, shared venues, mutual acquaintances who moved between the blues establishment and the new rock landscape that had grown partly from its roots. What Albert King had been saying, not always in print, but in conversation, and in the way that older musicians communicate their frustrations through suggestion and implication rather than direct accusation, was that he recognized his own techniques in Jimi Hendrix's playing. The bends, the way the guitar screamed, the particular physical approach to coaxing sound from the instrument that went beyond what notation or theory could transmit and lived instead in the body, in the hands, in the specific set of physical habits that Albert had developed across decades. He wasn't alone in this. The broader conversation about influence and credit in popular music during this period was charged and complicated. Rock and roll had emerged from rhythm and blues, which had emerged from blues, which had emerged from the particular musical traditions of the African American South. And at each stage of that evolution, the originators had received less recognition and financial compensation than those who came after them. It was a pattern so consistent that it had become, for many of the musicians involved, simply the expected reality of the industry. But expectation doesn't make injustice bearable. It just makes it familiar. Albert King was not a man who dealt comfortably with familiar injustices. He was, by most accounts, a direct person, large in physical presence, large in personality, unwilling to reduce himself to politeness when politeness would require pretending that something didn't bother him. He had earned his reputation the hard way, in rooms where nobody was giving anything away, and he carried that earning like an additional physical weight, something you could sense when he walked into a space, something that preceded him. So when he encountered Jimi Hendrix backstage, in whatever specific configuration of time and place that encounter occurred, the conversation that followed was not a casual exchange between equals meeting for the first time. It was a reckoning. A moment in which an older musician decided to make explicit what had been implicit, to transform a conversation about influence into a demonstration. Albert King picked up the guitar. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He simply reached out, in the way that a man with absolute confidence in his own authority reaches out, and lifted the instrument from wherever it rested, and cradled it in those enormous hands, and prepared to do what he had always done: let the music speak for itself. What he played was the blues at its most fundamental and most demanding. Not a simple progression. Albert King was never interested in the simple, in the comfortable, in the version of the blues that had been sanded smooth for audiences who wanted the emotion without the difficulty. He played the music in its most essential form, the bends that required a physical strength most guitarists couldn't summon, the notes held past the point where other players would have released them, the particular sound that could only come from this specific man playing this instrument in this specific upside-down configuration that no one else had ever fully replicated. The room went quiet. This is the detail that appears in every version of the story. Not because silence is dramatic, though it is, but because silence in a room full of musicians means something specific. It means that something is happening that demands attention. It means that the social calculus of the space has shifted. It means that everyone present has registered, simultaneously, that what they are witnessing is not ordinary. Albert played, and the sound filled the room with something that could not be faked. 20 years of this. 20 years of cotton fields and church music and cramped buses and venues that didn't have names worth remembering, and recordings that didn't get the distribution they deserved, all of it compressed into those bends, those impossible stretches of string and steel that produced a sound so human and so raw that it bypassed every conventional framework for evaluating music and arrived directly in the body. He was saying, "This is where it comes from. This is the source. These are the hands that held this fire before you carried it out into the wider world." When he finished, he held the guitar out to Jimi. And here is where the story becomes something other than a confrontation. Because what Jimi Hendrix did next, what he has always done in every account of encounters like this one, was not what defensiveness or ego would have produced. He didn't deflect. He didn't minimize. He didn't reach for the standard response of the newly famous artist who feels their originality has been questioned. He took the guitar. He held it for a moment in the way that people hold things they are about to speak through rather than about. And then he played. What came out was not an imitation of Albert King. It was not a demonstration of technique for its own sake. It was not a performance designed to prove a point or establish superiority. It was something more complex and more honest than any of those things. It was a conversation with everything he had just heard, a response in the same language, building on the same foundation, taking the same raw material and transforming it through his own particular relationship to sound, his own accumulated years of listening and absorbing and pushing the instrument past what it thought it was capable of. He played the blues. He played it in a way that was unmistakably rooted in what Albert King had just demonstrated. The same DNA was audible, the lineage was clear and unbroken, but it was also unmistakably his own. The psychedelic overtones, the way feedback became a structural element rather than an accident, in the particular phrasing that moved between blues tradition and something that didn't have a name yet. All of it present, all of it alive, all of it connected to the man who had just held the guitar before him. Something shifted in the room again, a different kind of silence. Not the silence of respect for authority, though that was there too, but the silence of recognition. The silence that happens when two people from across a distance of time and geography and generation realize that they are speaking the same language. Albert King was a man who had heard a great deal of music in his life. He had been around long enough to recognize the difference between someone who had borrowed a surface and someone who had absorbed a depth. He had heard enough imitation to know what genuine engagement with source material sounded like. And what he heard in Jimi Hendrix's playing, what he could not deny, regardless of whatever frustrations had preceded this moment, was genuine engagement. Not theft, not appropriation in the shallow sense, something more complicated and more honest. The young man had truly listened, had truly internalized, had carried the fire forward, not just borrowed the flame. This is the moment that accounts from the period circle back to, again and again, when the people who were present tried to describe what they witnessed. Not the confrontation, not the challenge, but the resolution, which was not really a resolution at all, in the sense of something being settled or concluded, but rather a recognition. Two men who had arrived at the same place through different roads, standing in the same small room, holding the same instrument, hearing, and finally and clearly the thing they shared. What is less often discussed, because music journalism and popular history tend to prefer the drama of confrontation over the complexity of what follows, is the conversation that reportedly took place after the playing stopped. Albert King was not a sentimental man. He did not, by most accounts, soften easily or forgive quickly. The grievances he carried were real, and they came from a real place, and a few minutes of exceptional guitar playing does not erase 20 years of watching other people receive the credit for foundations that you laid. That is not how human beings work. That is not how justice functions. But he was also a musician. And musicians understand something that people outside the tradition sometimes miss, that influence is not theft, that the movement of sound from one set of hands to another is not the same as the taking of something that should have stayed. The blues, specifically, has always understood this. The blues is a tradition built on transmission. Every great player learned from the players before them. Every great player carried forward something that was given, transformed it, made it their own, and passed it on to the next set of hands. This was not a bug in the system. This was the system itself. Albert King had learned from people who came before him. He had absorbed their approaches, their vocabularies, their particular physical relationships to the instrument, and he had made something new from what they gave him. The same chain that ran from Robert Johnson through Muddy Waters through Albert King ran, undeniably, through Jimi Hendrix. The question was never whether the chain existed. The question was whether the people who forged each link received the acknowledgement they deserved. On that point, Albert King was right, and Jimi Hendrix, who was many things but was not dishonest about his influences when directly asked about them, largely agreed. In the conversations that followed, not just in this encounter but in the broader pattern of how he spoke about his influences in the years of his career, Jimi Hendrix was consistent in naming Albert King as one of the primary architects of his sound, not as a footnote, not as a polite gesture toward an older tradition, but as a genuine and central influence. The bends. Always the bends. When people asked how he produced that particular quality of note, that wideness, that physical presence, and that sense of a sound being stretched past its natural limit until it became something more human than musical, Jimi Hendrix returned, repeatedly, to Albert King. To the specific physical technique, to the particular relationship between body and instrument that only Albert's configuration could produce, and that Jimi had worked for years to understand and adapt on his own right-handed instrument. But adaptation is not replication, and this is perhaps the most important thing that Backstage Encounter clarified, for both of them and for everyone present. The fact that Jimi Hendrix had absorbed Albert King's influence so deeply that it became structural to his own sound was not evidence of copying. It was evidence of something rarer, genuine learning. The kind of learning that goes past surface and reaches into essence. The kind that transforms rather than merely borrows. When Jimi Hendrix bent a string, he was not imitating Albert King. He was continuing a conversation that Albert King had started, in his own voice with his own particular relationship to the physical act of making the guitar speak. The DNA was shared. The fingerprint was distinct. Albert King understood this. You don't spend decades as a working musician without developing the ability to hear the difference. And what he heard in that small room, after he handed the guitar back, was the difference. This is not to say that the grievances were resolved. Credit and compensation in the music industry of that era were distributed with breathtaking inequity, and no single backstage encounter, however meaningful, could alter the structural realities of a business that had built itself on the systematic undervaluing of black musical innovation. The blues musicians who laid the foundation for rock and roll received a fraction of what they deserved. financially, critically, culturally, and Albert King's situation was no exception to this pattern. His records were celebrated by musicians and connoisseurs, but the mainstream recognition that should have followed their influence arrived slowly, partially, and never in the form it should have taken. What happened between Albert King and Jimi Hendrix in that backstage room was not justice. It was something smaller and more human than justice. It was recognition. One artist seeing another. One tradition acknowledging the next generation. One set of hands passing the instrument to another, with all the complicated feelings that transmission carries. There is a tendency in stories about artistic influence to resolve too cleanly, to arrive at a moment of mutual understanding that wraps everything up in a way that feels satisfying but does not quite reflect the actual texture of human relationships, of artistic debt, of the way that music moves through time, carrying its histories with it like silt carried by a river. The real story is always messier than the clean version. The real story contains the grievances alongside the recognition, the complexity alongside the connection. Albert King never stopped being who he was, a man who had earned everything he achieved through work that the world was slow to adequately honor. And Jimi Hendrix never stopped being who he was, an artist who had absorbed the tradition so deeply that it lived in him at a level below consciousness, emerging in his playing as something simultaneously ancient and entirely new. Their encounter did not change either of these fundamental realities. What it did was create a moment, a specific, charged, irreducible moment in which two enormous musical presences occupied the same small space and spoke to each other in the only language that truly mattered to either of them. Albert King picked up the guitar and said with every note he played, "Here is where this comes from. Here is what this cost. Here is what I built, with these hands, in these years, in these rooms that you will never have to play in again because the road was already cleared when you arrived." Jimi Hendrix took the guitar back and said, with every note he played, "I heard you. I carried it. I made it my own, but I carried it. The fire didn't stop with you. It came through you and I took it, and now I'm taking it somewhere you couldn't have gone because you already went somewhere I couldn't reach." And the room, which had been full of noise and smoke and the ordinary business of the music world, went quiet in a way that rooms only go quiet when something true has been said. There is a particular loneliness to being ahead of your time that the blues musicians of Albert King's generation understood intimately. It is the loneliness of having the answer before anyone knows the question has been asked, of building something that won't be recognized as architecture until long after you've moved on to the next project, of watching the world celebrate the people who arrived after you, using the roads you built without always pausing to acknowledge that the roads didn't appear by accident. Albert King lived in that loneliness. He built his career in it, and he arrived, through decades of that particular kind of solitude, at the absolute certainty of his own worth, which is why he could walk into a backstage room where a globally famous guitarist stood and reach out, without hesitation, and take the guitar. He knew what he had. He had always known. What he found, perhaps, in that encounter, what the music revealed in ways that conversation might not have managed, was that the transmission had been real, that the influence was not superficial, that when Jimi Hendrix played, you could hear Albert King in there, not as an imitation but as a root, as a foundation, as the thing that everything else grew from. That is a different kind of recognition than money or critical acclaim. In some ways, it is more durable. The financial inequities of the music industry could be documented, argued about, perhaps partially remedied. But the fact of transmission, the fact that Albert King's hands had shaped Jimi Hendrix's sound in ways that would echo through everything Jimi touched, that was beyond the reach of industry structures or critical reception. That simply was. It existed in the music itself, audible to anyone who knew how to listen. And Albert King knew how to listen. He had been listening his whole life, to the church music of his childhood, to the blues that surrounded him in Mississippi, to the players who came before him, whose techniques he absorbed and transformed into something that bore his own enormous stamp. He had spent 60 years listening to the way sound moved through the world, and he could hear, in what Jimi Hendrix played, the particular shape of his own contribution. That is not a small thing. That is, perhaps, the most that any artist can hope for. Not just that their work is appreciated in their own time, but that it continues to speak in the hands of the people who come after them. That the fire is carried forward, transformed, made new, and never extinguished. Jimi Hendrix would die less than 2 years after this period, in September 1970, at the age of 27, in circumstances that remain the subject of some historical debate, though the broad outline is well documented. And he left behind a body of work that permanently altered the landscape of popular music, and he left behind a generation of guitarists who would spend decades attempting to understand and absorb what he had done. Albert King would continue performing and recording for another 2 decades. He would receive increasing recognition as the years passed. More interviews, more acknowledgement in the critical press, more young musicians making the pilgrimage to hear him and understand where the foundation was actually laid. He would outlive Jimi Hendrix by 22 years, and in that time he would watch his own influence ripple outward through generation after generation of players who carried, in their hands, something that could be traced back to a left-handed giant from Mississippi who had played a right-handed guitar upside down and produced sounds that the instrument, in theory, should not have been capable of making. He died in 1992 in Memphis, Tennessee, having made his full circuit. What he left behind, what both of these men left behind, in their different ways, along their different roads, was not just music. It was a demonstration of how music moves, how it travels from one set of hands to another, how it changes in the travel without losing its essential nature, how the same fire can burn in a Mississippi juke joint, and in a London concert hall, and in a Greenwich Village apartment, and in every small room where 2 musicians sit down together and let the instrument say what conversation cannot. The backstage encounter between Albert King and Jimi Hendrix is usually told as a story about confrontation. About the moment when a titan of the blues challenged a younger star to prove his worthiness. About the drama of one great guitarist taking another's instrument and daring him to match what came out. But the real story, the one that lives underneath the drama, the one that the music itself was trying to tell, is about recognition. About 2 people who were, in the deepest sense, speaking the same language, arriving at the moment when that shared language became audible to both of them at once. Albert King picked up the guitar and said, "Listen." Jimi Hendrix listened, and then he played. And what they heard, together, in that small and smoky room, was the sound of the blues doing what the blues has always done. Surviving. Transforming. Moving forward through time, carrying everything it has been through every hand it has touched, arriving in the present moment changed and unchanged, ancient and alive, impossible to fully own and impossible to fully let go. The guitar passed between them like a flame passed between 2 candles. Neither of them extinguished anything. They only continued the burning. And that, in the end, is what the blues asks of everyone who touches it. Not perfection, not originality in the sense of owing nothing to what came before, but honesty. The honest acknowledgement of where the fire came from, and the honest commitment to carrying it forward, and the willingness to pass it on, without diminishment, to the next set of hands. Albert King understood this. It was what he had been doing his whole life. Jimi Hendrix understood it too. It was what his playing, at its best, always demonstrated. That night, in whatever specific configuration of place and time it occurred, 2 men who had built their lives around the honest pursuit of sound looked at each other across the length of a guitar and recognized in each other the same commitment. That recognition did not resolve everything. It was not meant to. Some things are too large to be resolved in a single room. But it was real. And in the music, which is the only place where the full truth of these encounters can actually be heard, it has never stopped being real. The blues keeps no secrets. It only asks you to listen.